The old man's hands moved with precise grace across the worn leather of expensive shoes, each stroke of his polishing cloth deliberate and measured. Most who passed his humble corner stand in downtown Millbrook never noticed how his eyes, sharp as steel beneath his grey cap, tracked every movement in the plaza. Fewer still knew that these same hands, now stained with polish and calloused from honest work, had once brought the city's most notorious criminals to justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Chen maintained his small shoe-shining station at the corner of Grand Avenue and 5th Street, with the same meticulous attention to detail he had once applied to tracking his targets through Millbrook's shadowed alleys. The early autumn morning brought a crisp breeze that rustled the newspaper headlines announcing yet another successful operation by the notorious Kingston Crew, whose influence had been steadily growing across the city's downtown district. His stand occupied a strategic position in front of the century-old Millbrook Commerce Building, its weathered brass and granite facade looming above the busy intersection. The location offered an unobstructed view of the plaza where the city's financial elite conducted their daily business, their expensive shoes inevitably finding their way to his care. Thomas had chosen this spot with the same tactical precision that had once made him legendary in certain circles, though those days were buried beneath years of carefully cultivated anonymity. The morning crowd moved with its usual urgency, men and women in tailored suits hurrying past with briefcases and smartphones, most sparing only the occasional glance at the elderly Asian man who kept their footwear immaculate. A few regulars nodded in greeting, appreciating his reliability and discretion, if not his true nature. Among them was Sarah Martinez, a junior partner at the building's largest law firm, who had noticed something different in the way the old Shoeshiner carried himself, a dignity that seemed at odds with his humble profession. The quiet of his morning routine was interrupted by the arrival of 3 men whose presence immediately altered the plaza's atmosphere. Led by Marcus Kingston Jr., heir to the Kingston family's legitimate business empire and rumored architect of their less savory enterprises, they moved through the crowd with the entitled confidence of predators among prey. Their shoes, Italian leather that cost more than most people's monthly rent, clicked against the plaza's granite pavers with deliberate authority. Thomas continued his work, his movements unchanged as the trio approached a nearby shop owner who had been refusing to pay their protection fees. His weathered hands maintained their steady rhythm, while his ears picked up the conversation with a clarity that would have surprised those who assumed his age had dulled his senses. The shop owner's voice trembled as Kingston's enforcers made their expectations clear. Detective Rebecca Chen, recently promoted to Millbrook's organized crime division and unknown to most as Thomas's daughter, observed the scene from her unmarked car across the plaza. She had chosen this assignment partly to maintain a discreet watch over her father, though she told herself it was purely professional interest in the Kingston Crew's activities. She knew pieces of her father's past, fragments shared during late-night conversations that hinted at a life lived in shadows, but even she didn't know the full extent of his former identity as the ghost of Millbrook. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shortened shadows across the plaza as more workers arrived for their day. Thomas attended to a young executive's wingtips, his careful attention masking his awareness of Kingston's men concluding their business with barely veiled threats. The shop owner's hands shook as he returned to his store, fear evident in every movement. A group of young professionals, buoyed by their recent promotions and expensive suits, approached Thomas's stand, their voices carried across the plaza, laden with the casual cruelty of those who had never known real struggle. "Hey, old man, one called out, his tone carrying the unmistakable edge of manufactured superiority. "Make sure you don't miss a spot. Wouldn't want to have to dock your pay." Thomas absorbed their mockery with the same quiet dignity that had once allowed him to move unseen through the city's criminal underworld. His response, when it came, was soft but clear, carrying the kind of authority that comes from absolute certainty rather than volume. "Every shoe tells a story, young man. Some stories are worth taking time to understand." Gee, the young men laughed, missing entirely the weight behind his words, the way his hands never faltered in their work, the practiced economy of movement that spoke of capabilities far beyond buffing leather. They were equally oblivious to the way Sarah Martinez watched the interaction with growing concern, or how Detective Chen's hand tightened on her steering wheel across the plaza. As the morning continued, Thomas maintained his vigil, watching as Kingston's men made their rounds, noting faces, patterns, and conversations with the same detailed attention he gave to each shoe that passed through his care. The city was changing, he reflected, not for the better. The Kingston Crew's influence was growing, protection rackets expanding, and the police seemed powerless to stop it. Perhaps, he thought as he methodically cleaned his brushes at day's end, it was time to tell his daughter the full story of the ghost of Millbrook. Time to explain why he had chosen this corner, this humble profession, and why sometimes the most effective guardian of justice was the one nobody thought to watch. The sun began its descent behind the city's towers, casting long shadows across his small stand, much like the shadows he had once used to protect his city. Michael Sullivan, head of building security at the Millbrook Commerce Building, had worked in law enforcement long enough to recognize when something wasn't quite what it seemed. For 3 years, he had observed Thomas Chen's shoe-shining operation. From his post in the lobby, and something about the old man's movements had always caught his trained eye. It wasn't anything obvious, just the way he positioned himself with clear sightlines of every entrance, how he could navigate through crowded spaces with an economy of motion that spoke of years of tactical training. Today, as Sullivan brought his own shoes for their weekly cleaning, he paid particular attention to the way Thomas handled his tools. Each brush, cloth, and tin of polish had its place, arranged with military precision. The movements of his hands, while aged, carried the unmistakable muscle memory of someone who had spent years handling more dangerous implements with the same careful attention. "Beautiful morning, Mr. Chen," Sullivan offered, settling into the elevated customer chair. Thomas nodded in acknowledgement, his eyes briefly meeting Sullivan's with a clarity that seemed to penetrate beyond the simple exchange of pleasantries. The security chief had seen that same evaluating gaze in veteran operators during his years on the force. "Indeed, Mr. Sullivan," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the quiet assurance of someone who had seen enough mornings to know the difference between peace and the absence of visible threat. "Though the weather seems to be changing." The comment might have seemed like small talk to others, but Sullivan noticed how Thomas's gaze flickered toward Kingston's men, who were now entering the high-end coffee shop across the plaza. As Thomas worked, his hands moving with practiced efficiency across the leather, Sullivan observed the morning crowd's reaction to the shoeshine stand. Most passed by without a second glance, their attention buried in phones or conversations. A few regulars exchanged greetings, and Sullivan noted how Thomas seemed to have an encyclopedic memory for their preferences and schedules. Sarah Martinez emerged from the building's revolving doors, her heels clicking purposefully across the granite. Unlike most, she slowed her pace as she passed, offering a genuine smile. "Good morning, Mr. Chen, Mr. Sullivan," she called out. Thomas inclined his head with a slight bow that carried a dignity far beyond his station. Sullivan had noticed how the young lawyer often positioned herself near the shoeshine stand during her coffee breaks. her sharp legal mind perhaps sensing the same incongruities that had caught his attention. The relative calm of the morning was interrupted by the return of Kingston's enforcers. They moved with the aggressive confidence of men who had never faced real resistance, their expensive suits and watches purchased with profits from extorted businesses. The lead enforcer, a man known only as Drake, made a show of flicking his cigarette ash near Thomas's carefully maintained stand. "Hey, old-timer!" Drake called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a predator toying with potential. "Pray, heard you've been here quite a while. Must be good for business having such a prime spot." The implied threat in his words was clear. The Kingston Crew was expanding their protection racket to include the plaza's smaller vendors. Sullivan felt his muscles tense, years of law enforcement instinct responding to the brewing confrontation. But before he could intervene, he noticed something remarkable. Thomas's posture had shifted almost imperceptibly, his weight now balanced in a way that Sullivan recognized from close-quarters combat training. The change was so subtle that Drake and his companions missed it entirely, but to Sullivan's trained eye it transformed the humble Shoeshiner into something altogether more dangerous. "Every spot has its purpose," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the same quiet certainty it always did. "Like every shoe that passes through here, every position tells its own story." His hands never stopped their methodical work on Sullivan's shoes, but there was something in the precision of his movements that gave his simple words additional weight. Drake's face darkened at the cryptic response, clearly expecting either immediate compliance or fearful negotiations. Before he could respond, Detective Chen appeared at the periphery of the plaza, her unmarked car rolling slowly past. The Kingston enforcers withdrew, but not before Drake shot a final warning look at Thomas's stand. As they departed, Sullivan noticed Thomas sliding something beneath his work surface, a small notebook where he had apparently been recording the enforcer's movements and patterns. The security chief pretended not to see, but he found himself re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about the unassuming Shoeshiner. "Your shoes are finished, Mr. Sullivan," Thomas announced, his voice betraying none of the tension from moments before. The leather gleamed with a perfect shine, each scuff and mark eliminated with expert care. As Sullivan stood to leave, he noticed how Thomas had positioned himself between the stand and Kingston's retreating men, a subtle positioning that would have given him multiple defensive options if the confrontation had escalated. "Thank you, Mr. Chen," Sullivan said carefully, extending his payment. "You know, in my line of work we say that the best security is often invisible to those it protects." The comment caused Thomas to look up, their eyes meeting in a moment of mutual recognition. A ghost of a smile touched the old man's lips, there and gone so quickly it might have been imagined. "Wise words, Mr. Sullivan," Thomas replied softly, "though sometimes the best way to remain invisible is to be seen doing exactly what everyone expects." He returned to cleaning his brushes, his movements precise and measured, leaving Sullivan to ponder the layers of meaning in their exchange. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The confrontation that transformed the plaza's quiet afternoon began with a scream. Sarah Martinez had been returning from court, her victory in a pro bono case against a predatory lending company still fresh in her mind, when she witnessed Drake and his associates cornering Mr. Park, the elderly owner of the corner convenience store in the alley beside the Millbrook Commerce Building. Thomas Chen's hands never paused in their methodical work on a client's Oxford shoes, but his eyes tracked every detail of the unfolding scene. The Kingston Crew had grown bolder in recent weeks, no longer bothering to maintain even a pretense of legitimate business during their collection rounds. Before we continue with what happened next, Let us know in the comments if you've ever witnessed someone standing up against injustice, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Drake's voice carried across the plaza, its false pleasantness barely masking the threat beneath. "Mr. Park, we've been more than patient, but the Kingston family can't protect businesses that don't appreciate our services." His two associates, both former MMA fighters turned enforcers, moved to flank the elderly shopkeeper, their stances practiced and predatory. Sarah Martinez had stepped forward, her legal training overriding her instinct for self-preservation. "Mr. Park is under the protection of Martinez Legal Aid," she announced, her voice carrying the authority she usually reserved for courtrooms. "Any action against him will result in immediate legal consequences." Drake's laugh held no humor as he turned toward her. "Counselor, I suggest you walk away. Some situations can't be solved with lawsuits." His hand moved toward his jacket, the gesture deliberate and threatening. The plaza had grown quiet, the usual crowd of business people and tourists suddenly finding reasons to be elsewhere. Thomas Chen set down his polishing cloth with precise care, the motion so controlled it drew no attention. His current client, a junior executive who had been absorbed in his phone, remained oblivious to the tension unfolding mere feet away. "Your shoes are finished, sir," Thomas said softly, his voice carrying that same quiet certainty it always did. As the executive stood to leave, fumbling with his wallet, Thomas's movements changed. The transformation was subtle but profound. His posture straightened almost imperceptibly, years seeming to fall away as he stepped around his stand. Each movement was measured, precise, carrying the kind of economy that comes only from decades of practiced violence. "Mr. Drake," Thomas called out, his voice still soft but somehow filling the plaza. "Perhaps we should discuss business practices that don't involve frightening elderly men and threatening young lawyers." His words, though polite, carried an edge that caused Drake's associates to exchange uncertain glances. Drake turned, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. "Stay out of this, old man. Stick to shining shoes and minding your own business." He took a step toward Thomas, his hand still hovering near his jacket. "Interesting choice of words," Thomas replied, moving with that same measured grace to position himself between Drake and his intended victims. "Business. When I first came to this country, I learned that true business builds communities. It doesn't prey on them." His eyes, no longer those of a humble shoeshiner, met Drake's with an intensity that made the enforcer pause. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Drake snarled, his facade of sophistication cracking. His associates moved to flank Thomas, their movements telegraphing their intentions to anyone with the training to see it. "On the contrary," Thomas responded, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. 3 men who mistake cruelty for strength, who think violence against the defenseless makes them powerful." His stance shifted slightly, adjustments so minimal they were nearly invisible, but transformed him into something deadly. Drake's patience snapped. His hand darted into his jacket, but before he could complete the motion, Thomas moved. The speed of his response shocked everyone watching. In less time than it took to blink, Drake's arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, his knees buckling as Thomas applied pressure to points that spoke of intimate knowledge of human anatomy. The two associates rushed forward, their MMA training evident in their stance. Thomas released Drake, allowing him to crumple to the plaza's granite pavers, and met their attack with a fluid grace that belonged more in a martial arts exhibition than a downtown plaza. His movements were precise, economic, and devastatingly effective. Seconds later, all 3 enforcers were on the ground, their groans of pain the only sound in the stunned silence that had fallen over the plaza. Thomas stood among them, his breathing steady, his posture once again that of a humble shoeshiner. Only his eyes, sharp as aged steel, betrayed the warrior that lay beneath the surface. Detective Chen arrived moments later, her unmarked car screeching. To a halt at the plaza's edge. She took in the scene with a professional's eye. 3 known Kingston enforcers on the ground, her father calmly returning to his stand, and a gathering crowd of witnesses, including Sarah Martinez, whose legal pad was already filled with rapid notes. "They slipped," Thomas explained quietly, as his daughter approached, his hands returning to their work with the polishing cloth. "The plaza's granite can be treacherous when one moves too aggressively." The ghost of a smile touched his lips as he began cleaning his brushes, the same methodical care evident in his movements as had been present in his efficient defense moments before. Sarah Martinez stepped forward, her legal training warring with what she had just witnessed. "I saw everything," she declared, holding up her notepad. "They were clearly the aggressors, and Mr. Chen acted in defense of others." Her eyes met Thomas's with new understanding, seeing for the first time the depths that lay behind his quiet demeanor. As Detective Chen began taking statements, Sullivan appeared at the plaza's edge, his face showing no surprise at the scene. Before him, he caught Thomas's eye and nodded once, a gesture of professional respect between men who understood the necessity of maintaining peace through readiness for violence. The plaza's routine gradually resumed, but something had fundamentally changed. The humble shoeshine stand was no longer just a fixture of the downtown landscape. It had become a statement, a line drawn between those who would prey on the community and those who would defend it, no matter how unassuming they might appear. The morning after the confrontation dawned with an unusual energy across Millbrook's financial district. Detective Rebecca Chen stood in the plaza, reviewing witness statements, while observing the steady stream of people who found reasons to pass by her father's shoeshine stand. The incident had transformed Thomas Chen from a fixture of the landscape into the center of attention, though he continued his work with the same quiet precision as always. Sarah Martinez emerged from the Millbrook Commerce Building's revolving doors, carrying a thick folder of legal documents. She had spent the night preparing injunction paperwork against the Kingston organization, her legal expertise finding new purpose in the wake of yesterday's events. The young lawyer paused at Thomas's stand, noting how he maintained his methodical routine despite the increased attention. "The DA's office is very interested in the statements I collected," Sarah informed them, her voice low enough to maintain privacy. "Especially given how many witnesses came forward. It seems Mr. Chen has more supporters than anyone realized." She placed her Oxford heels on the stand's footrests, the action providing cover for their conversation. Detective Chen nodded, her professional demeanor masking her personal investment in the situation. "The Kingston organization has been untouchable for years because people were too afraid to speak up. Something about yesterday changed that calculation." Her eyes met her father's, searching for answers to questions she'd never dared ask during family dinners. Thomas continued his work on Sarah's shoes, his movements precise and unhurried. "Fear," he said softly, "is like a mirror. It shows us who we truly are. Sometimes people just need to see their reflection clearly to remember their strength." His words carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned in shadows most present would never understand. Michael Sullivan approached from his security post, his stance casual, but his eyes constantly scanning the plaza. "Words spreading through certain channels," he reported quietly. "The Kingston family is having an emergency meeting at their estate. Sources say Marcus Kingston Jr. is particularly interested in learning more about our local shoeshiner." The morning sun caught the silver in Thomas's hair as he methodically applied polish to Sarah's second shoe. "Interesting things, shoes," he remarked, his voice carrying that same quiet certainty it always did. They tell you where a person's been, hint at where they're going. Marcus Kingston Jr.'s Italian leather speaks of boardrooms and luxury, but his souls show he spends time in places businessmen shouldn't. Sarah's legal mind quickly grasped the implications. You've been cataloguing their movements all this time, haven't you? Every shoe that came to your stand, every pattern you observed. She trailed off, seeing her own cases against the Kingston organization in a new light. A wise observer once told me that the best way to understand a city is from the ground up, Thomas replied, his hands never pausing in their work. Every scuff mark tells a story. Every worn sole marks a path. His eyes met Sullivan's, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The security chief nodded slowly. That's why you chose this spot. The plaza's the perfect observation post for the financial district. Every major player in the city passes through here eventually. His law enforcement training allowed him to appreciate the elegant simplicity of the strategy. Detective Chen felt a complex mixture of pride and concern as she watched her father work. The Kingston organization won't take yesterday's humiliation lightly, she warned. They've built their reputation on fear. They can't afford to let this go unanswered. No, Thomas agreed, his voice carrying a trace of something harder, older. They can't, but perhaps that's what this city needs, a reminder that not all predators hunt from positions of power. Sometimes the most effective guardians are those who watch from below. Mr. Park approached the stand, carrying a warm container of traditional soup, a gesture of gratitude that spoke volumes about the community's changing dynamics. My wife insisted, he said simply, placing the container near Thomas's tools. She says a warrior needs strength for the battles ahead. The word warrior hung in the air, transforming the humble shoeshine stand into something else. A focal point for the community's growing resistance against the Kingston organization's influence. Thomas accepted the gift with a slight bow that carried decades of martial discipline in its execution. Sarah finished reviewing her notes, her legal pad now filled with potential angles of attack against the Kingston family's operations. We're building something here, she realized aloud, something bigger than just one confrontation or one court case. Yes, Thomas replied, his careful hands putting the final touches on her shoes. Communities are built on small acts of courage, on people choosing to stand rather than look away. Yesterday simply revealed what was already there, the potential for change. As the morning progressed, more plaza regulars found reasons to linger near the shoeshine stand. Each carried their own stories of Kingston intimidation, of witnessed injustices, of small indignities endured. Thomas listened as he worked, his quiet presence somehow making it safer for these truths to emerge. Detective Chen watched it all, understanding now why her father had chosen this humble position years ago. He hadn't retired from his mission as she'd once thought. He'd simply found a different way to wage it, building trust and gathering intelligence one shoe at a time, positioning himself at the perfect intersection of power and invisibility. The plaza had become more than just a public space. It had transformed into the front line of a coming conflict, though few passing by would recognize it as such. And at its center stood a simple shoeshine stand, where an old warrior continued his vigil, waiting for the inevitable response from those who believed their power made them untouchable. Detective Rebecca Chen sat across from her father in his modest apartment above an old Vietnamese restaurant in Millbrook's east side. The evening light filtered through traditional paper screens, casting gentle shadows across the spare furnishings that reflected Thomas Chen's minimalist philosophy. A single photograph on the wall showed a younger Thomas in military uniform, standing beside Rebecca's mother at their wedding. "You never told me the whole story," Rebecca said quietly, her hands wrapped around a cup of green tea that had grown cold. "All these years, I thought you chose the shoeshine stand because it was simple, peaceful. But it was always more than that, wasn't it?" The events in the plaza had forced her to reevaluate everything she thought she knew about her father. Thomas moved with that same measured grace she had witnessed during the confrontation, retrieving an old wooden box from a hidden compartment behind a loose floorboard. "Your mother always said you had her intuition," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of memories. "She knew from the beginning what I was doing, why I couldn't simply retire." The box, when opened, revealed newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Headlines from 15 years ago spoke of a mysterious vigilante known only as the Ghost, who had systematically dismantled several criminal organizations operating in Millbrook's poorest neighborhoods. The articles stopped abruptly around the time Thomas had established his shoeshine stand. "After your mother passed," Thomas continued, his fingers tracing the edges of the clippings, "I realized that fighting from the shadows wasn't enough. The city needed something different, not just someone to confront evil, but someone to watch, to understand, to be present when people needed hope most." Rebecca spread the articles across the small table, her investigator's mind connecting dots that had always been present but never quite visible. "The Ghost never killed," she noted, reading accounts of criminals found incapacitated but alive, often in positions that led to their activities being exposed. "Even then, you chose a harder path." "Taking a life is easy," Thomas replied, his voice dropping to that quiet tone that somehow carried more authority than a shout. "Living with that choice is harder. I learned that in special forces, and again as the Ghost, but helping people find their own strength, their own courage to stand up, that's the most difficult path of all, and the most worthwhile." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sarah Martinez stood in the hallway, holding a thick folder of legal documents and wearing an expression that mixed determination with concern. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she began, but Thomas raised a hand in gentle welcome. "No interruptions, Sarah. Please join us." He prepared another cup of tea with the same precise movements he applied to his craft downstairs. "I assume this is about tomorrow's meeting with the DA's office?" Sarah settled at the table, her legal training evident in how she organized her documents, even in this informal setting. "The Kingston organization is mobilizing their legal team. They're trying to spin yesterday's incident as an unprovoked attack on legitimate businessmen." She paused, glancing at the newspaper clippings. Her eyes widened as she recognized the connection. "You were the Ghost," she whispered, pieces falling into place. "The timing of your arrival in the plaza, the way you've positioned yourself at the heart of the financial district. It wasn't coincidence at all." Thomas nodded slowly. 15 years ago, I fought in shadows against those who would prey on the vulnerable. But shadows, while useful, can only conceal. Sometimes the greatest power lies in being seen, but being seen as what others expect to see. Nothing more. Rebecca leaned forward, her professional demeanor momentarily set. "Aside, the Kingston family, they're not just another criminal organization, are they? There's something more personal about this." "Marcus Kingston Sr., Thomas replied, selecting a particular clipping from the table, "was one of the last cases I handled as the Ghost. He escaped prosecution, but his operation was severely damaged. Now his son has rebuilt it, stronger and more insidious than before, hiding behind legitimate businesses and legal frameworks." Sarah's legal mind quickly grasped the implications. "That's why you've been gathering evidence all these years. Every observation, every pattern of movement, every conversation overheard at your stand. You've been building a case. A case that needs both legal expertise and law enforcement cooperation," Thomas confirmed, looking meaningfully at both women. "The Kingston organization has evolved. They can't be fought the same way I fought their predecessors. They require a different approach. A combined effort, Rebecca realized, her investigator's instincts aligning with her father's strategy. Law enforcement, legal action, and community support all working together. The Ghost's methods combined with legitimate channels. And a presence in plain sight, Thomas added softly, to remind people that standing up to injustice doesn't always require shadows and vigilante justice. Sometimes it just requires the courage to say, enough. Sarah studied the old Vigilante cases, her legal training finding new significance in the methodical way each criminal enterprise had been dismantled. These weren't just attacks, she observed. Each action was calculated to expose specific vulnerabilities, create paper trails, generate evidence that could be used in court. Your mother taught me that, Thomas told Rebecca, a rare smile softening his features. She said that true justice needs both the sword and the scales. As the Ghost, I was only using the sword. Now, perhaps, we can achieve a better balance. The evening deepened around them as they began planning, each bringing their unique perspectives to the challenge ahead. Rebecca's law enforcement expertise, Sarah's legal acumen, and Thomas's deep understanding of both the city's shadows and its soul combined to form something new, a strategy that could fight the Kingston organization on multiple fronts. As they worked, Thomas prepared more tea with the same careful attention he gave to his craft in the plaza. Tomorrow, he said quietly, the Kingston organization will make their move. They have to maintain their image of power. But they'll find that the plaza has changed, the people have changed. Rebecca met her father's eyes, seeing in them the same quiet strength that had protected her throughout her childhood. You've been preparing for this for years, haven't you? Everything. The location of your stand, the relationships you've built, the evidence you've gathered, it's all been leading to this moment. Every journey has its destination, Thomas replied, his voice carrying that familiar, gentle certainty. The Kingston organization believes that power flows from fear and violence. We'll show them a different kind of power, the kind that comes from people standing together, supporting each other, choosing to build rather than destroy. Sarah gathered her documents, her expression determined. I should go prepare for tomorrow's meetings. But Mr. Chen... She paused at the door. Thank you. Not just for yesterday, but for showing us that sometimes the most powerful acts of courage are the quiet ones. As Sarah departed, Rebecca helped her father clean up the articles and documents. Mum would be proud, she said softly, of how you've chosen to continue your mission. Thomas carefully returned the wooden box to its hiding place, his movements carrying the weight of years of purpose. Your mother understood something I took years to learn, he replied. That true strength isn't found in the ability to strike from shadows, but in the courage to stand in the light day after day, doing what needs to be done. The night settled over Millbrook, and in his modest apartment above the Vietnamese restaurant, an old warrior prepared for one more battle, not with fists or shadows this time, but with truth, justice, and the quiet strength that had become his hallmark. The pre-dawn hours found Thomas Chen methodically preparing his stand in the plaza, each brush and tin of polish arranged with tactical precision. The rising sun painted Millbrook's skyline in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the granite pavers where yesterday's confrontation had altered the district's delicate balance of power. Michael Sullivan emerged from the Millbrook Commerce Building security office, his early morning rounds bringing him past the Shoeshiner stand. His practiced eye noted subtle changes in the plaza's atmosphere. Additional security cameras had been installed overnight, their presence both a protection and a warning. Kingston's people have been asking questions, Sullivan reported quietly, ostensibly pausing to check his phone. They've got someone digging into your background. Professional investigator, ex-military intelligence. His tone carried both warning and curiosity about what such an investigation might uncover. Thomas continued his preparations, his movements, unhurried yet purposeful. "Records can be interesting things," he replied softly. "Like footprints in sand, they tell stories, but only the stories we choose to leave behind." His hands moved with practiced efficiency, each tool finding its precise place. Sarah Martinez arrived earlier than usual, her tailored suit and briefcase projecting professional confidence. But there was a new awareness in how she carried herself, an understanding of the currents moving beneath the plaza's surface. "The DA's office has agreed to meet this afternoon," she informed them, settling into the customer's chair. "They're particularly interested in the documentation you've provided." 15 years of observations, Thomas remarked, beginning work on her shoes with his characteristic attention to detail. Every scuff mark tells a story, every worn sole marks a path. The Kingston organization's footprints are everywhere, if one knows how to read them. Detective Chen appeared at the plaza's edge, her unmarked car positioned for optimal surveillance. She had spent the night coordinating with trusted officers, positioning resources for whatever the day might bring. The weight of her father's revelations about his past as the ghost had added new dimensions to her understanding of both him and their current situation. "Marcus Kingston, Jr. has called a meeting of his top lieutenants," she reported, her voice low as she approached the stand. "Our sources say he's bringing in additional muscle from their operations in neighboring cities." Her concern for her father's safety warred with her professional understanding of the developing situation. Thomas nodded slightly, his hands never pausing in their work. "The plaza will be busy today," he observed. "The investment bank is hosting their quarterly board meeting. High-profile clients will be arriving throughout the morning." His tone suggested this convergence was less coincidental than it appeared. Mr. Park approached from his convenience store, carrying his usual morning offering of tea. But today there was a different energy in his movement, a quiet dignity that hadn't been present before yesterday's events. "The other shop owners wish to speak with you," he said softly to Thomas. "They are tired of living in fear." "Fear," Thomas replied, accepting the tea with a slight bow, "is like water. It can erode the strongest foundations over time, or it can be channeled, used to turn the wheels of change." His eyes met Mr. Park's with quiet understanding. "Perhaps it's time for the community to choose which path they'll follow." Sarah finished reviewing her legal documents, her expression thoughtful. "The Kingston organization's legal team is formidable," she noted. "They've managed to block previous investigations through a combination of technical challenges and witness intimidation. Legal battles, like any conflict, are won through preparation and positioning," Thomas responded, applying a final polish to her shoes. "Sometimes the most effective strategy is to let the opponent's strength become their weakness." His words carried the weight of experience from both his military past and his years as the ghost. Throughout the morning, a steady stream of plaza regulars found reasons to pause near the stand. Each interaction carried underlying currents of support and determination. The community was mobilizing not with dramatic declarations or overt resistance, but through small acts of solidarity and shared purpose. Sullivan observed it all from his security post, noting how the plaza's dynamics had shifted. "It's like watching a chess game," he remarked during a quiet moment. "Every piece being positioned, every move calculated." His law enforcement background allowed him to appreciate the subtle orchestration at play. "Chess suggests opponents of equal standing," Thomas replied, his voice carrying that same quiet certainty it always did. "This is something different. The Kingston organization believes they're playing a game of power and fear, They haven't realized yet that we're building something else entirely. As the morning progressed, the plaza filled with its usual mix of business people, tourists, and local workers. But beneath the surface of routine, there was a palpable sense of anticipation. The community had awakened to its own potential. For resistance, guided by the quiet strength of a man who had traded shadows for sunlight, vigilante justice for something more profound. Thomas Chen continued his work, each movement precise and measured, watching as the pieces fell into place for the confrontation to come. The humble shoeshine stand had become the fulcrum upon which the future of Millbrook's soul would balance, not through violence or fear, but through the steady accumulation of small acts of courage and the power of people choosing to stand together. Marcus Kingston Jr. stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, gazing down at the financial district that his family had shaped through decades of calculated manipulation. The morning sun reflected off the glass, and steel towers that surrounded him, creating an illusion of golden authority that matched his carefully cultivated image of legitimate power. "Tell me again," he instructed the former military intelligence operative seated behind him, "everything you've found about this Shoeshiner." His voice carried the cultured refinement of expensive private schools, but beneath it lay an edge of barely contained fury. Colonel James Harrison, now operating as a private investigator, spread his findings across Kingston's imported mahogany desk. Thomas Chen, age 62, immigrated from Vietnam in 1975, following the fall of Saigon. Military background with special forces, though most records are heavily redacted. The colonel's precise diction reflected his years of military service. But there's something else, a pattern that emerged when I cross-referenced the timeline. Kingston turned from the window, his Italian suit moving with practiced elegance. "Explain." 15 years ago, when your father's organization faced its most significant setbacks, there were reports of a vigilante known as the Ghost. Harrison's fingers traced a pattern through his assembled documents. The methodology matches what we saw in the plaza yesterday, precise, non-lethal interventions designed to expose rather than eliminate. Kingston's hand tightened on his crystal tumbler, though his face remained composed. "My father spoke of the Ghost before he passed, said it was the closest anyone ever came to dismantling everything we'd built." He moved to his desk, examining the photographs of Thomas Chen at his stand. "And now you're telling me this same man has been sitting in the heart of our territory, watching us for years." "The timing fits," Harrison confirmed. "The Ghost disappeared around the same time Chen established his shoeshine operation, but there's more." He selected a particular document. "Your father's last major project before his death was acquiring properties in the Eastern District, the same area where Chen currently resides." Kingston processed this information with the calculated precision that had allowed him to expand his father's criminal enterprise into legitimate businesses. "He's been waiting," he realized, "gathering intelligence, building connections. Every shoe he's shined, every conversation he's overheard, it's all been preparation." "There's something else you should see," Harrison added, retrieving a final folder. "Chen's daughter is Detective Rebecca Chen, recently promoted to Organized Crime Division, and that lawyer who's been building cases against your subsidiary company's Sarah Martinez. She's been a regular at his stand for the past 3 years." A muscle twitched in Kingston's jaw as he reviewed the surveillance photos showing the network of relationships centered around the humble shoeshine stand. "He's positioned himself perfectly," he acknowledged, professional appreciation warring with growing anger. "A vantage point where power brokers and working people intersect, where he can build trust with both worlds." Drake entered the office, his arm still bearing the evidence of yesterday's humiliation. "The men are assembled downstairs," he reported, unable to completely mask his discomfort under Kingston's scrutiny. "Including the specialists you requested from the Chicago operation." Kingston nodded, his decision crystallizing. "The ghosts' greatest weapon was always anonymity," he stated, turning back to the window. "He struck from shadows, vanished before the consequences could touch him. But now—" A cold smile touched his lips. "Now he's bound himself to that corner, to those people. He's given us something to target." "Sir," Harrison interjected, his military training compelling him to point out strategic considerations, "a direct confrontation in the financial district carries significant risks. Chen's positioned himself too well. Any move against him will be witnessed by dozens of influential people." "Precisely," Kingston replied, his voice carrying the same refined certainty his father had used when teaching him about power. "The ghost's mistake was choosing to become Thomas Chen, choosing to care about a community. Shadows can't be hurt, but people can. Communities can be broken." He turned to Drake, his expression hardening. "Begin with the shop owners who witnessed yesterday's incident. Show them the cost of choosing the wrong side. Then move on to anyone who's spoken to him, done business with him, shown him any support." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "By the time we're done, that plaza will be a testament to what happens when people forget their place." "And Chen himself?" Drake asked, eager for revenge, but wary after yesterday's demonstration. "He'll watch it all happen," Kingston stated, with cold certainty. "Watch as everything he's built crumbles, as every person he tried to protect suffers for his choices. And when he's broken, when he's lost everything, just like he once did to my father." He lifted his tumbler in a mock toast to the plaza below. "Then we'll remind everyone in this city what real power looks like." Harrison observed his employer carefully, recognizing the dangerous combination of wounded pride and calculated malice. "Chen's not alone anymore," he reminded them. "He's got official support now, connections in law enforcement and legal circles." "Good," Kingston replied, setting down his glass with precise control. "Let them try to fight this through official channels. Every legal challenge, every police investigation will only give us more targets, more pressure points to exploit." He turned to face his assembled lieutenants. "My father's mistake was treating the ghost like a physical threat that could be eliminated through direct confrontation. But I've learned from history. Sometimes the most effective violence is the kind that leaves no visible marks, the kind that destroys hope rather than bodies." As his men departed to execute his orders, Kingston remained at the window, watching the morning crowd flow through the plaza far below. From this height, Thomas Chen's stand was barely visible, a small point of stillness in the urban current. But Kingston had learned early that true power lay in understanding patterns, in recognizing how small points of resistance could threaten carefully constructed systems of control. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Ghost," he murmured to the city below. "Some men aren't meant to walk in the light." The financial district awakened to subtle but significant changes. Additional security personnel, ostensibly from a legitimate firm, but bearing the unmistakable bearing of Kingston's organization, had established a presence at key intersections. Their dark suits and earpieces projected authority, while their carefully positioned patrols created an invisible net around the plaza. Thomas Chen arrived at his stand earlier than usual, the pre-dawn darkness still holding sway over the city. His movements, as he prepared for the day ahead, carried their usual precision, but there was an added awareness in how he positioned each tool, ensuring clear sight lines and unobstructed access to all approaches. Detective Rebecca Chen observed from her unmarked vehicle as Kingston's men established their positions. Her team had spent the night coordinating with trusted officers, positioning plainclothes personnel throughout the district. "They're being careful," she reported into her secure phone. Everything looks legitimate on the surface. They're using licensed security contractors, proper permits, everything by the book. Of course, Thomas replied softly, his voice carrying through the early morning air. Marcus Kingston Jr. understands the power of perception. He's not just planning a show of force, he's staging a performance. His hands moved steadily as he prepared his stand, each action deliberate and measured. Sarah Martinez arrived. With the first light, her legal briefcase containing carefully prepared injunctions and documentation. The DA's office is ready, she informed them, pausing at the stand. We've identified vulnerable points in Kingston's business structure. Once we start pulling threads, the whole facade could unravel. They'll expect that, Thomas noted, his attention seemingly focused on arranging his brushes, but his awareness extending to every movement in the plaza. Legal challenges, police investigations, these are known quantities. Kingston will have prepared countermeasures. Michael Sullivan emerged from the Millbrook Commerce Building, his security team, enhanced by additional personnel he trusted. My people are in position, he reported quietly. We've upgraded the plaza's surveillance system overnight. Every angle is covered. He paused, studying the positioning of Kingston's security teams. They're creating choke points, controlling access to key businesses. The morning progressed with a facade of normalcy that barely concealed the underlying tension. Regular customers approached Thomas's stand, each interaction now carrying additional weight. Mr. Park's convenience store remained conspicuously empty, Kingston's security personnel subtly discouraging customers through their mere presence. You should see what's happening in the Eastern District, Detective Chen reported during a quiet moment. Small businesses that showed support yesterday are finding their deliveries delayed, their regular customers intimidated. It's all very subtle, very deniable. Thomas continued his work, his movements unchanging despite the growing pressure. A young executive approached for his regular shoe shine, noticeably nervous about crossing the invisible lines Kingston's men had established. Courage, Thomas said softly as he worked, often begins with simple acts, like choosing where to get your shoes shined. The executive straightened slightly, understanding dawning in his eyes. As he departed, he nodded to several colleagues who had been watching. One by one, they too approached the stand, each small act of defiance building upon the last. Sarah Martinez spent her morning moving between law offices in the surrounding buildings, her presence a reminder of the legal framework being constructed. Kingston's team is responding, she reported. They're filing countersuits, pressuring witnesses, using every legal maneuver to delay and obstruct. As expected, Thomas replied, his voice carrying that same quiet certainty. They believe they're fighting a legal battle, a struggle for control. They haven't yet understood that we're engaged in something else entirely. His eyes met Sarah's, with subtle emphasis. Sometimes, the most important victory is not in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those watching. Throughout the morning, the plaza became a stage for an intricate dance of power and resistance. Kingston's security teams maintained their professional facade while gradually tightening their control. Yet with each restriction, the community found new ways to adapt and respond. Store owners began leaving their doors open, creating clear lines of sight to Thomas's stand. Office workers adjusted their routes, ensuring regular traffic past his position. Even the food cart vendors repositioned themselves, their presence helping to maintain open spaces that Kingston's men couldn't easily control. It's remarkable, Sullivan observed during a quiet moment. Every move they make to isolate you ends up creating new connections. The harder they push, the more people choose to push back. His military experience allowed him to appreciate the subtle strategy at play. People inherently understand the difference between true strength and mere force, Thomas responded, his hands never pausing in their work. Kingston believes he's demonstrating power, but he's actually revealing its limitations. Each person who chooses to walk past his men, each business that stays open despite pressure, becomes part of something larger than themselves. Manu. As the morning wore on, the plaza's transformation became increasingly apparent. What had begun as a show of force by Kingston's organization had evolved into a testament to community resilience. The invisible lines they had tried to draw were being crossed and redrawn by countless small acts of everyday courage. Detective Chen watched it all, understanding now the full scope of her father's strategy. He hadn't just been gathering evidence during his years at the stand. He had been building a foundation of trust, preparing the community for this very moment. The ghost's methods had evolved, trading dramatic confrontations for something more profound, the quiet power of people choosing to stand together. The confrontation began not with violence, but with paperwork. As the morning sun reached its zenith over Millbrook's financial district, a team of inspectors descended upon the plaza's small businesses. They moved with bureaucratic efficiency, clipboards and citations at the ready, each bearing credentials from various city departments that, upon closer inspection, all traced back to Kingston-controlled offices. Thomas Chen observed their methodical approach from his stand, noting how they started with Mr. Park's convenience store. The elderly shop owner stood resolute as they presented him with a litany of alleged violations, each carrying substantial fines that could cripple his small business. Before we continue with what happened next, share your thoughts in the comments about standing up to intimidation. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage in unexpected places. Sarah Martinez materialized at Mr. Park's side, her legal expertise providing a shield against the bureaucratic assault. "I'll need to see the specific ordinances you're citing," she declared, her professional demeanor matching their official pretense. "And, of course, we'll require documentation of your authorization to conduct these inspections." The inspectors hesitated, their momentum briefly checked by this unexpected resistance. Beyond them, Kingston's security personnel shifted their positions, their choreographed movement creating a subtle but threatening presence. Detective Chen watched from her surveillance position, documenting every interaction, every implied threat. "Interesting," Thomas remarked softly to his current customer, a senior banking executive who had deliberately chosen this moment to have his shoes shined. "How power reveals itself in different ways. Sometimes through force, sometimes through paper, but always seeking the same thing, compliance through fear." The executive, Jonathan Way, adjusted his tie with deliberate care. "Fear only works when people feel isolated," he responded, his voice carrying across the plaza. "The Kingston family's biggest mistake was giving us time to realize we're not alone." As if to emphasize his point, other business leaders from the surrounding towers began emerging, each making their way to Thomas's stand. Kingston's inspectors found their tasks increasingly complicated as more lawyers from Martinez's firm appeared, each armed with documentation challenging their authority. The security teams attempted to establish a perimeter, but the growing crowd of well-dressed executives and ordinary citizens simply ignored their presence, continuing their business with quiet determination. Michael Sullivan coordinated with his legitimate security personnel, ensuring clear paths remained open while documenting every move Kingston's men made. "They're calling for reinforcements," he reported quietly to Detective Chen, "but they can't make any overt moves without risking their legitimate corporate contracts." The tension reached a new level when Drake appeared at the plaza's edge, his arms still bearing evidence of his previous encounter with Thomas. He carried a document folder similar to the inspector's, but his approach was more direct. "Mr. Chen," he announced, his voice carrying forced politeness, "we have concerns about your permit status and compliance with city regulations." Thomas continued his work on another customer's shoes, his movements unhurried and precise. "Interesting timing," he replied, his soft voice somehow carrying clearly through the growing crowd. "Perhaps we should discuss the regulations concerning business intimidation and organized harassment as well." Drake's face darkened, but before he could respond, Jonathan Way stepped forward. "My bank's board of directors would be very interested in reviewing the lending relationships with certain Kingston family enterprises," he stated clearly, "particularly in light of recent community concerns about their business practices." Other business leaders joined in, each adding their own subtle but significant pressure. A real estate developer mentioned reconsidering leases. An investment manager spoke of regulatory compliance reviews, each statement delivered with professional courtesy yet carrying unmistakable weight. The plaza had become a battlefield where the weapons were words and influence rather than force. Kingston's teams found themselves increasingly constrained by the very bureaucratic system they had tried to weaponize. Every attempt to isolate targets was met with community solidarity, every official pressure countered by equal or greater official response. "You don't understand what you're starting," Drake warned, his composure cracking slightly. "Mr. Kingston won't forget who stood against him today." "No," Thomas agreed, finally looking up from his work, his eyes meeting Drake's with calm intensity. "He won't, just as we won't forget who stood with us." His gaze swept the plaza, taking in the gathered community, from powerful executives to ordinary citizens, all choosing to be present in this moment of resistance. Detective Chen watched as Kingston's forces began a strategic withdrawal, their carefully planned pressure campaign unraveling in the face of unified opposition. The inspectors retreated with their unsigned citations. The security teams maintained their positions, but with noticeably less aggressive posturing. "This isn't over," Drake declared as he backed away, but his threat carried less weight now, undermined by the community's clear rejection of Kingston's authority. "No," Thomas replied softly, returning to his work with unshaken focus. "It's just beginning. Your employer wanted to demonstrate power today." His hands moved with their usual precision across well-worn leather. "Instead, he helped us demonstrate something far more significant, the strength of people who choose to stand together." As the confrontation subsided, the plaza settled into a new rhythm, different from before, but stronger. Regular customers continued their routines with deliberate purpose, each shoe shine becoming an act of quiet defiance. The community had faced its first real test against Kingston's pressure, and rather than breaking, had found its collective strength. As evening approached, Thomas Chen closed his stand with the same methodical precision he applied to all tasks. But tonight was different. Instead of his usual departure through the plaza's main thoroughfare, he led a select group through a service entrance in the Millbrook Commerce Building's basement. Michael Sullivan had ensured the security cameras in this section were operating on a convenient loop. "The city's original foundation lies beneath us," Thomas explained as they descended into the building's substructure. Detective Chen, Sarah Martinez, and Jonathan Way followed closely, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. During Prohibition, smugglers created an extensive tunnel network. Most were officially sealed, but some remained accessible to those who knew where to look. Sullivan met them at a heavy maintenance door, using his security credentials to grant access to a section that appeared on no official blueprints. "The Kingston organization isn't the first group to try controlling this district through fear," he commented, leading them into a tunnel that showed signs of recent maintenance. "And they won't be the last to discover its hidden resistances." The passage opened into a larger chamber that had been converted into an operations center. Maps covered one wall, showing the district's underground network in detail. Surveillance feeds displayed key locations throughout the financial district, while communications equipment monitored police and security frequencies. Detective Chen recognized some of her fellow officers among the personnel manning the stations. 15 years of preparation, Thomas said softly, indicating the sophisticated setup, not just watching and waiting, but building, creating infrastructure for the moment it would be needed. His hand traced a path on one of the maps, showing how the tunnels connected key locations throughout the district. Sarah Martinez studied. The legal documents spread across a central table, her eyes widening as she recognized their significance. These are property records, utility easements, historical preservation documents. You've created a legal framework to protect these passages. The ghost's methods had to evolve, Thomas acknowledged, his voice carrying quiet certainty. Violence alone cannot create lasting change. Sometimes the most effective resistance operates through legitimate channels, hidden in plain sight. Jonathan Way moved to examine the financial data displayed on several screens, these tracking systems. They're monitoring capital flows through the district's major institutions. His banker's expertise recognized the sophisticated analysis being conducted. You're not just gathering evidence of Kingston's criminal activities, you're mapping their entire financial network. Knowledge flows through many channels, Thomas replied. Every shoe that comes to my stand carries traces of its owner's path. Every conversation overheard adds another piece to the puzzle. He indicated a section of the map where several tunnels converged. The Kingston organization believes they control the district's surface. They haven't considered what moves beneath. Detective Chen observed her father with new understanding. This is why you chose that location for your stand. It's not just about watching the plaza, it's a hub for this entire underground network. Her investigator's mind appreciated the layers of strategy involved. Sullivan activated a holographic display showing real-time movements of Kingston's security teams above. They're establishing new patrol patterns, trying to lock down the Yee's district block by block, but they're limited by what they can see. He highlighted several hidden access points that allowed discreet movement throughout the area. Tomorrow, Kingston will escalate, Thomas stated, his tactical assessment born from years of experience. His public failure today will demand a more aggressive response. He'll expect us to rely on legal challenges and official channels. A subtle smile touched his lips. He won't expect us to move like ghosts through his own territory. Sarah reviewed the accumulated evidence with professional appreciation. This goes beyond individual criminal acts. We're looking at systematic corruption, financial fraud, manipulation of city agencies. Her legal mind was already constructing arguments that could dismantle Kingston's empire through legitimate means. The city's heart beats in its foundations, Thomas observed, his hand resting on an old support pillar. Kingston believes power flows from above, from penthouse offices and corporate boardrooms. He's forgotten that true strength often rises from below, from the spaces between official structures. Jonathan Way studied the financial analyses with growing excitement. These patterns, if we can prove systematic manipulation of market forces. He paused, understanding dawning. You're not just planning to expose their criminal activities. You're positioning us to undermine their legitimate operations simultaneously. A tree falls harder when its roots are exposed, Thomas confirmed. His quiet voice carried through the chamber with subtle authority. Kingston believes he's fighting a simple turf war. He hasn't realized he's facing a comprehensive campaign on multiple fronts. The underground command center hummed with purposeful activity as final preparations were made. Each person present understood they were part of something larger than individual resistance. They were participating in a carefully orchestrated operation, years in the making. Remember, Thomas addressed the gathered group, his words carrying the weight of long experience. Our strength lies not in confrontation, but in coordination, not in matching force with force, but in moving through spaces our opponents believe secure. Tomorrow, when Kingston moves to demonstrate his power, he'll discover that the true measure of strength isn't in what can be seen, but in what remains hidden until the precise moment of need. The ancient tunnels seemed to absorb his words, the city's foundations bearing witness to another chapter in its ongoing story of power and resistance. Above, Kingston's forces patrolled streets they thought they controlled, unaware of the currents moving beneath their feet, preparing to reshape the very ground on which they stood. Marcus Kingston Jr. stood in his penthouse war room, surrounded by digital displays showing real-time surveillance of the financial district. The morning sun had barely touched the horizon, yet his forces were already implementing a comprehensive lockdown of the area. Private security teams had established checkpoints at major intersections, while plainclothes operatives moved through the growing crowd of early commuters. Our legal team has secured emergency permits for construction work, Colonel Harrison reported, indicating the heavy equipment being positioned around the plaza. We can effectively isolate the target area under the guise of infrastructure maintenance. His military precision showed in the systematic way they were cutting off approach routes to Thomas Chen's stand. Kingston studied the tactical display with cold calculation. What about the underground access points we identified? The previous day's failure had taught him not to underestimate his opponent's preparation. Construction crews are sealing them systematically, Harrison confirmed. We're citing urgent structural concerns to justify the rapid response. City officials have been appropriately compensated for their cooperation. He paused, checking his tablet. However, there's something else you should see. The colonel brought up financial data streams on the main display. We're detecting unusual patterns in market activity. Several major institutions are quietly adjusting their positions regarding Kingston Holdings and its subsidiaries. His expression showed professional concern. It appears someone has been mapping our entire corporate structure, identifying vulnerable points. Kingston's jaw tightened as he recognized the implications. The ghost was never just watching our street-level operations. He was building a comprehensive understanding of our entire organization. His hand clenched on the back of his leather chair. 15 years of patience, gathering intelligence one shoe shine at a time. Drake entered the room, his presence adding a more visceral element to the strategic discussion. The men are in position, he reported, including the specialists, are from our more aggressive operations. His anticipation of violence was evident in his stance. Remember, Kingston cautioned, we maintain plausible deniability. Everything must appear legitimate on the surface. He turned to the tactical display. The ghost's strength was always in forcing his opponents to reveal themselves through overreaction. We won't make that mistake. The operation began with subtle precision. Construction barriers appeared at strategic points, their placement carefully calculated to disrupt normal foot traffic patterns. Security teams conducted detailed ID checks at building entrances, creating delays that radiated through the morning crowd. Surveillance teams monitored every approach to Thomas Chen's stand, documenting anyone who attempted to reach him. Sir, Harrison interrupted Kingston's observation. We're detecting movement in areas we thought we'd secured. Somehow, people are still getting through our perimeter. The colonel's military experience recognized the signs of a well-prepared opposition. And there's more. Our financial monitoring systems are showing coordinated actions across multiple institutions. Kingston studied the data flows with growing concern. Major investors were quietly adjusting their positions, reducing exposure to Kingston-controlled enterprises. Legal inquiries were being filed simultaneously across different jurisdictions. Each action seemed minor in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of systematic pressure. He's not just fighting us in the plaza, Kingston realized, his carefully maintained composure showing cracks. He's orchestrating a comprehensive campaign across multiple domains. The revelation carried echoes of his father's warnings about underestimating the ghost. "Sir!" Drake's urgent tone drew their attention to the street-level feeds. Despite the barriers and security presence, a steady stream of business leaders and ordinary citizens continued to find ways to reach Thomas Chen's stand. Each interaction seemed choreographed to demonstrate defiance of Kingston's authority. Kingston watched as Jonathan Way, accompanied by several other banking executives, deliberately bypassed a security checkpoint. "Identify everyone," he ordered, his voice carrying deadly calm. "Every person who chooses to stand against us today will learn the cost of their decision." "There's something else," Harrison added, bringing up new data. "We've detected unauthorized access to building systems throughout the district, security cameras, access controls, environmental systems. Someone has been establishing backdoor controls for months, possibly years." The implication struck Kingston with full force. While his organization had focused on visible displays of power, the ghost had been patiently building a parallel infrastructure of resistance. Every system they relied on for control had been subtly compromised, prepared for this moment of confrontation. "Enough," Kingston declared, his refined facade cracking further. "If they want to see real power, we'll show them. Authorize the specialists to move more aggressively. Let's remind everyone why the Kingston name commands respect." But even as he gave the order, security feeds showed Thomas Chen continuing his work with unchanging precision. Each movement of his hands across expensive leather seemed to mock Kingston's attempts at control, demonstrating a different kind of power. One built on patience, preparation, and the quiet strength of a community choosing to stand together. The morning sun climbed higher over Millbrook's towers, illuminating a district transformed into a battlefield where the weapons were influence and information rather than traditional force. Kingston's visible power confronted the ghost's hidden infrastructure, setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine not just control of the plaza, but the soul of the city itself. Sarah Martinez stood before Judge Eleanor Richmond in the Federal District Court's emergency session. Her carefully prepared documentation spread across the council table. The morning light filtered through the courtroom's tall windows, casting long shadows across proceedings that would determine far more than mere legal matters. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying the quiet confidence she had learned from observing Thomas Chen, "we're seeking an emergency injunction against the Kingston Development Corporation and its subsidiaries for systematic abuse of municipal processes to engage in organized harassment." Kingston's legal team, led by the formidable Patricia Blackwood, immediately objected. "This is a transparent attempt to interfere with legitimate business operations, Your Honor. The Kingston organization is conducting necessary infrastructure maintenance with full municipal approval." Judge Richmond, known for her penetrating insight, studied the documentation before her. "Ms. Martinez, you're making extraordinary claims about the coordinated abuse of city processes. I'll need to see extraordinary evidence." Sarah nodded, opening a sealed folder Thomas had provided that morning. "Evidence gathered over 15 years, Your Honor. A systematic pattern of permit manipulation, selective enforcement, and corporate intimidation." Her hands moved with precise certainty across the documents, echoing the methodical way Thomas handled his tools. As she presented the evidence, surveillance feeds in Kingston's war room showed his forces tightening their grip on the plaza. Construction barriers created an ever-shrinking perimeter around Thomas's stand, while security teams intercepted anyone attempting to approach. The physical pressure mounted even as Sarah fought in the legal arena. The court's attention is directed to Exhibit C, Sarah continued, her voice steady, a comprehensive analysis of permit applications and enforcement actions over the past decade, showing a clear pattern of discriminatory application based on business owners' willingness to comply with Kingston's unofficial demands. Judge Richmond leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued by the meticulous documentation. Ms. Blackwood, how do you respond to these patterns? The statistical analysis appears quite compelling. Kingston's attorney maintained her professional composure, but Sarah noted the slight tension in her shoulders. Your Honor, correlation does not imply causation. Many factors influence municipal enforcement patterns. Indeed, Sarah interrupted smoothly, producing another document. Which is why we've also provided sworn statements from multiple city officials detailing specific instances of pressure and influence. Officials who are prepared to testify about how the Kingston organization has systematically corrupted municipal processes. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Richmond reviewed the new evidence. In the plaza, Detective Chen watched Kingston's forces grow increasingly aggressive in their containment efforts. The physical and legal battles were reaching simultaneous crescendos. Furthermore, Sarah pressed her advantage, we have documentation of specific retaliatory actions taken against businesses that refuse to comply with Kingston's demands. Actions that correlate precisely with the deployment of their private security forces, including this morning's so-called infrastructure maintenance. Patricia Blackwood rose to object, but Sarah was already moving to her key evidence. Your Honor, I direct the court's attention to Exhibit F, a comprehensive financial analysis showing how the Kingston organization has used legitimate businesses to mask systematic extortion and market manipulation. In the plaza, Thomas Chen continued his work with unshaken focus, even as the space around his stand grew increasingly confined. His quiet persistence seemed to mock Kingston's attempts at control, each precise movement a testament to patient resistance. Judge Richmond studied the financial documentation with growing concern. These patterns. Ms. Blackwood, your clients will need to provide a very compelling explanation for these discrepancies. Sarah felt the momentum shifting, years of carefully gathered evidence finally finding its moment. We're not just seeking an injunction against today's actions, Your Honor. We're requesting the court recognize this as part of a RICO pattern, justifying immediate cessation of all Kingston security operations and a freeze on their corporate assets pending full investigation. The boldness of the request caused a stir in the courtroom. In his penthouse command center, Kingston received word of the legal challenge with growing alarm. His carefully constructed facade of legitimate business operations faced its greatest threat not from violence or force, but from methodically gathered evidence presented by a determined young lawyer. Ms. Martinez, Judge Richmond spoke after several tense moments, you've presented compelling evidence of systematic abuse of legal and municipal processes. This court cannot ignore such a comprehensive pattern of coordinated manipulation. She turned to Patricia Blackwood. Counsel, your clients have 1 hour to cease all security operations in the financial district and withdraw their construction barriers. Furthermore, the judge's voice carried the weight of law as she detailed the immediate restrictions on Kingston's operations. Sarah maintained her professional composure, but beneath it, she felt the satisfaction of justice finally moving into action. The plaza. Thomas Chen looked up briefly from his work, a ghost of a smile touching his lips as if he had somehow sensed the turning tide. The morning sun had fully illuminated the courtroom now, driving away the shadows where corruption had flourished. Sarah gathered her documents with the same precise care she had observed in Thomas's movements, understanding now that true victory often came not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient, methodical preparation and the courage to act when the moment demanded. Marcus Kingston Jr. descended from his penthouse sanctuary into the plaza with the measured stride of a man unaccustomed to having his will thwarted. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the granite pavers. As he approached Thomas Chen's stand, where the elderly shoeshiner continued his work with unchanging precision despite the chaos surrounding him, Detective Chen observed from her position, noting how Kingston's remaining security personnel created a perimeter around their employer. Despite the court order, a core group of his most loyal operators maintained their presence, suggesting this final confrontation would not be resolved through legal channels alone. 15 years, Kingston stated, his cultured voice carrying across the now quiet plaza. 15 years watching, waiting, gathering evidence. I have to admire the patience, the dedication to such a long game. He stopped several paces from Thomas's stand, studying the man who had systematically dismantled his family's power structure. Thomas continued working on a customer's shoes, his movements betraying no reaction to Kingston's presence. Some things, he replied softly, are worth taking time to do properly, like polishing shoes or protecting a community. His hands moved with the same careful precision that had characterized both his current profession and his past as the ghost. Kingston's carefully maintained composure showed subtle cracks. You could have struck at any time. Why wait? Why spend years shining shoes when you had the power to act? The question carried genuine curiosity beneath its veneer of controlled anger. Power comes in many forms, Thomas responded, finally looking up to meet Kingston's gaze. Your father never understood that. He saw only force, control, the ability to make others bend to his will. His voice remained quiet, but carried clearly to everyone watching. True strength lies not in what you can take, but in what you choose to build. Build? Kingston's laugh held no humor. You've destroyed everything my family created. Our businesses, our influence, our legacy, all undone by a man pretending to be nothing more than a humble shoeshiner. His hand moved slightly, causing Detective Chen and several plainclothes officers to tense, but Thomas remained perfectly still. I destroyed nothing, Thomas corrected gently. I simply showed people their own strength. The courage that was always there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. He gestured to the plaza around them, where community members stood witness despite the remaining security presence. Your father's legacy was built on fear. Fear cannot sustain itself forever. Kingston's composure cracked further. And what of your legacy, the great ghost, reduced to cleaning shoes? Was it worth sacrificing your legend for this? His gesture encompassed the modest stand and its simple tools. Legends, Thomas replied, returning to his work with unbroken focus. Shadows, they fade in true light. But the small acts of courage, the daily choices to stand against fear, these create something lasting. His hands moved steadily across the leather, each stroke precise and purposeful. Enough philosophy, Kingston snapped, his refinement giving way to raw anger. You force my hand, old man. If the system won't protect what's mine, perhaps it's time to remind everyone why the Kingston name was feared in the first place. He made a subtle gesture, and his remaining security personnel moved to create a tighter circle. Thomas set down his polishing cloth with careful deliberation. Still thinking in terms of fear, he observed quietly, still believing that power flows from the ability to threaten and intimidate. His movements as he stood carried the same economy of motion that had once made him legendary in the shadows. "Sometimes," Kingston replied, his hand moving toward his jacket. "Fear is the only language people understand." But before he could complete his motion, he realized something had changed. The plaza's atmosphere had shifted subtly but significantly. From every direction, people emerged from shops and offices, not with weapons or threats, but with phones recording, with witnesses' eyes, with the quiet determination of a community that had found its collective courage. Jonathan Way stood with his fellow banking executives. Mr. Park and other small business owners formed a line of silent resistance. Sarah Martinez appeared with a team of legal observers, while Detective Chen's officers moved to strategic positions. "You see," Thomas said softly, "that's the difference between us. You spent years building walls to protect your power. I spent years building bridges to share it." His stance was relaxed but ready, carrying decades of training beneath its surface calm. "Look around you, Mr. Kingston. Look at what your fear has created and what our patience has built." Kingston's gaze darted around the plaza, seeing for the first time the full extent of what he faced. Not just one man, not just law enforcement or legal challenges, but an entire community standing together. His security team shifted uncertainly, recognizing that their usual tactics would only worsen their situation. "It's over," Thomas stated quietly, his voice carrying that same gentle certainty it always had. "Not because of my actions, but because these people have chosen to stop being afraid. Your father's time has passed. The question now is whether you're wise enough to accept it." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plaza as federal agents methodically processed the scene. Marcus Kingston Jr. sat in the back of an unmarked vehicle, his perfectly tailored suit now wrinkled, his carefully constructed world unraveling, thread by thread. Detective Chen supervised the operation while Sarah Martinez coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office, their months of preparation culminating in this decisive moment. Thomas Chen continued his work at his stand, his movements unchanged despite the activity surrounding him. Each stroke of his polishing cloth remained as precise as ever, even as federal agents collected evidence from Kingston's security team and documented the morning's events. His quiet persistence in maintaining his routine spoke volumes about the strength that had allowed him to wait 15 years for this day. "The RICO indictments are being processed now," Sarah reported, approaching Thomas's stand with a thick folder of documents. "The evidence you gathered, combined with today's events and the witness statements, has given us everything we need." Her voice carried professional satisfaction tinged with something deeper, respect for the patient strategy that had made this possible. Jonathan Way emerged from a cluster of financial executives who were providing statements to federal investigators. "The market is already responding," he informed them, his banker's expertise evident in his analysis. "Kingston Holdings stock is suspended from trading, and their banking partners are freezing accounts pending investigation. The financial infrastructure they built is collapsing faster than anyone anticipated." Sullivan maintained his position, near the plaza's entrance, coordinating with federal agents to secure the scene. "Kingston's private security contracts are being terminated across the city," he reported. "Without their legitimate business facade, their entire protection racket is falling apart. Small business owners are already coming forward with years of documentation." Mr. Park approached Thomas's stand, carrying a tray of tea with steady hands that spoke of newfound confidence. "My son says more shop owners are organizing," he shared, setting the tray down carefully. "They're forming a business association to prevent anyone else from exploiting the community like Kingston did." His voice carried pride in the transformation he had witnessed. Detective Chen watched as Kingston was transferred to federal custody, noting how his air of untouchable authority had evaporated in the face of community resistance. We found evidence in their offices linking them to criminal enterprises across 3 states, she informed the group. This goes far beyond what we initially suspected. The ghost's patience revealed a network that multiple agencies had been trying to uncover for years. Thomas accepted a cup of tea from Mr. Park with a slight bow, his movements carrying the same dignity that had marked both his years as a vigilante and his time as a shoeshiner. Sometimes, he observed quietly, the most effective way to fight darkness is not with more shadows, but with patient illumination. Kingston believed his power lay in what he could conceal. He never understood that true strength emerges in the light. Sarah organized her documents with methodical precision, learned from watching Thomas at his craft. The civil suits will proceed parallel to the criminal cases, she explained. We are already receiving calls from other communities where the Kingston organization operated. Your evidence has provided a template for similar actions across the country. The real work begins now, Thomas remarked, returning to his customer's shoes with unbroken focus. Dismantling an empire of fear is one thing. Building something better in its place requires a different kind of strength. His hands moved steadily across the leather, each stroke a reminder of the patient dedication that had brought them to this moment. Throughout the afternoon, a steady stream of community members found reasons to pass by Thomas's stand. Each interaction carried new meaning, not just gratitude for his role in their liberation, but recognition of their own capacity for resistance. The plaza had become more than just a public space. It was now a symbol of what people could achieve when they chose to stand together. Your father would be proud, Detective Chen said softly, watching another group of small business owners provide statements to federal investigators. Not just of what you accomplished, but of how you chose to do it. Thomas paused in his work, looking up at his daughter with eyes that held both wisdom and gentle humor. He always said that true victory isn't in defeating an enemy, but in transforming them into something better. He gestured to where Kingston sat in federal custody. Perhaps even now there's hope for transformation. As evening approached, the plaza began to settle into a new rhythm. Federal agents coordinated the collection of evidence while legal teams processed statements and documentation, but beneath the official activities, a deeper change was evident. People moved through the space differently now, with heads held higher and steps more confident. The shadow of fear that had hung over the community for so long had been replaced by something stronger, the quiet certainty of unified purpose. Sullivan approached one final time, his security team transitioning control to federal authorities. It's really over, he stated, though his tone made it partially a question. 15 years of waiting, watching, preparing, all for this moment. Thomas looked up from his work, his expression carrying the same gentle certainty it always had. No, he replied softly. Not over. Just beginning. What we did today was remove an obstacle. What happens next, what these people choose to build, with their newfound strength, that's the true victory we've been working toward all along. 1 month after Kingston's arrest, the financial district showed subtle but significant signs of transformation. The morning light caught the newly restored facades of small businesses that had once borne the weight of Kingston's extortion. Thomas. Chen's shoeshine stand remained a constant presence, though its meaning in the community had evolved from a symbol of resistance to a reminder of patient strength. Sarah Martinez stood before the district's business owners in the renovated community center that had once served as their underground command post. The space now hosted regular meetings where shop owners and corporate executives alike gathered to discuss the district's future. Her legal expertise had shifted from fighting corruption to helping build new frameworks for community cooperation. The Civil Recovery Fund has been established, she announced to the assembled group. The federal seizure of Kingston assets, combined with the class action settlements, has created a substantial resource for community development. Her presentation reflected the same meticulous attention to detail she had learned from watching Thomas at his craft. Jonathan Way, representing the district's financial institutions, stepped forward with additional news. We've established a micro-lending program specifically for small businesses affected by the Kingston organization. The approval process will be overseen by a community board to ensure transparency and fairness. The banking executive's commitment to ethical business practices had become a model for others in the industry. Detective Chen, recently promoted to lead the department's new Community Integrity Unit, shared updates on the ongoing investigation. Kingston's network extended further than we initially realized. The evidence gathered over those 15 years has helped identify similar operations in other cities. Several jurisdictions are now implementing what they're calling the Ghost Protocol, combining community engagement with long-term strategic intelligence gathering. Mr. Park, now serving as chairman of the newly formed Merchants Association, reported on the district's recovery. Shop owners are no longer afraid to speak up when they see wrongdoing. We have created support systems, sharing resources and information. The community has learned that together we are stronger than any attempt at intimidation. Throughout the meeting, Thomas maintained his usual position at his stand outside, his hands moving with characteristic precision across well-worn leather. The plaza had become more than just a public space. It served as a living reminder of how patient resistance and community solidarity could overcome systemic corruption. Michael Sullivan, whose security team had been expanded to include community liaison officers, coordinated with local businesses to implement new safety protocols. The difference now, he observed, watching the morning crowd move through the plaza, is that security isn't imposed from above. It grows from community trust and cooperation. The underground tunnel network, no longer needed for clandestine operations, had been officially mapped and incorporated into the district's emergency response plans. What had once served as hidden passages for resistance now stood ready to protect the community in times of crisis, a transformation that reflected the broader changes in the district. Sarah's law firm had established a permanent community justice center in the Millbrook Commerce Building, offering legal support to small businesses and individuals. We're not just responding to problems anymore, she explained during a quiet moment at Thomas's stand. We're helping people build protective frameworks, understanding their rights, creating legitimate channels for addressing grievances. Thomas listened as he worked, his movements unchanged despite the evolution around him. Change, he observed softly, is like polishing leather. Each stroke builds upon the last, revealing the true character beneath the surface. His hands moved steadily across a customer's shoes, the routine serving as both practical service and gentle metaphor. The district's transformation extended beyond physical security and legal frameworks. Jonathan Way had introduced financial literacy programs for small business owners, while Detective Chen's unit focused on building bridges between law enforcement and the community. The multi-layered approach reflected Thomas's teaching. The true strength came from building connections rather than walls. Regular customers still brought their shoes to Thomas, but their conversations had evolved. Instead of whispered concerns about Kingston's influence, they now shared plans for business expansion, community initiatives, and collaborative projects. The Shoeshiner stand remained a hub of information exchange, but the information now built up rather than exposed corruption. Mr. Park's son, inspired by the community's transformation, had started a youth mentorship program. We teach them not just business skills, he explained to Thomas, but the importance of patience, observation, and standing together. Your example showed us that true change requires both courage and wisdom. As the afternoon sun cast its warmth across the plaza, Thomas continued his work with unchanging dedication. Each precise movement, each careful stroke of his tools, demonstrated that the most profound changes often came not through dramatic gestures, but through patient, consistent action. The district's transformation, like the perfect shine he crafted, on each pair of shoes, emerged from attention to detail and unwavering commitment to doing things properly. The Ghost's methods had evolved from shadow operations to community illumination, proving that the most effective way to fight corruption was not through force or fear, but through the patient nurturing of collective strength. The plaza stood as testament to this truth. Its daily rhythms, now marked not by tension and surveillance, but by the quiet confidence of people who had discovered their power to shape their own destiny. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plaza as federal agents methodically processed the scene. Marcus Kingston, Jr. sat in the back of an unmarked vehicle, his perfectly tailored suit now wrinkled, his carefully constructed world unraveling, thread by thread. Detective Chen supervised the operation while Sarah Martinez coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office, their months of preparation culminating in this decisive moment. Thomas Chen continued his work at his stand, his movements unchanged despite the activity surrounding him. Each stroke of his polishing cloth remained as precise as ever, even as federal agents collected evidence from Kingston's security team and documented the morning's events. His quiet persistence in maintaining his routine spoke volumes about the strength that had allowed him to wait 15 years for this day. The RICO indictments are being processed now, Sarah reported, approaching Thomas's stand with a thick folder of documents. The evidence you gathered, combined with today's events and the witness statements, has given us everything we need. Her voice carried professional satisfaction, tinged with something deeper, respect for the patient strategy that had made this possible. Jonathan Way emerged from a cluster of financial executives who were providing statements to federal investigators. The market is already responding, he informed them, his banker's expertise evident in his analysis. Kingston Holdings stock is suspended from trading, and their banking partners are freezing accounts pending investigation. The financial infrastructure they built is collapsing faster than anyone anticipated. Sullivan maintained his position near the plaza's entrance, coordinating with federal agents to secure the scene. Kingston's private security contracts are being terminated across the city, he reported. Without their legitimate business facade, their entire protection racket is falling apart. Small business owners are already coming forward with years of documentation. Mr. Park approached Thomas's stand, carrying a tray of tea with steady hands that spoke of newfound confidence. My son says more shop owners are organizing, he shared, setting the tray down carefully. They're forming a business association to prevent anyone else from exploiting the community like Kingston did. His voice carried pride in the transformation he had witnessed. Detective Chen watched as Kingston was transferred to federal custody, noting how his air of untouchable authority had evaporated in the face of community resistance. We found evidence in their offices linking them to criminal enterprises across 3 states, she informed the group. This goes far beyond what we initially suspected. The Ghost's patience revealed a network that multiple agencies had been trying to uncover for years. Thomas accepted a cup of tea from Mr. Park with a slight bow, his movements carrying the same dignity that had marked both his years as a vigilante and his time as a shoeshiner. Sometimes, he observed quietly, the most effective way to fight darkness is not with more shadows, but with patient illumination. Kingston believed his power lay in what he could conceal. He never understood that true strength emerges in the light. Sarah organized her documents with methodical precision, learned from watching Thomas at his craft. The civil suits will proceed parallel to the criminal cases, she explained. We're already receiving calls from other communities where the Kingston organization operated. Your evidence has provided a template for similar actions across the country. The real work begins now, Thomas remarked, returning to his customers. Shoes with unbroken focus. Dismantling an empire of fear is one thing. Building something better in its place requires a different kind of strength. His hands moved steadily across the leather, each stroke a reminder of the patient dedication that had brought them to this moment. Throughout the afternoon, a steady stream of community members found reasons to pass by Thomas's stand. Each interaction carried new meaning, not just gratitude for his role in their liberation, but recognition of their own capacity for resistance. The plaza had become more than just a public space. It was now a symbol of what people could achieve when they chose to stand together. Your father would be proud, Detective Chen said softly, watching another group of small business owners provide statements to federal investigators. Not just of what you accomplished, but of how you chose to do it. Thomas paused in his work, looking up at his daughter with eyes that held both wisdom and gentle humor. He always said that true victory isn't in defeating an enemy, but in transforming them into something better. He gestured to where Kingston sat in federal custody. Perhaps even now, there's hope for transformation. As evening approached, the plaza began to settle into a new rhythm. Federal agents coordinated the collection of evidence, while legal teams processed statements and documentation, but beneath the official activities, a deeper change was evident. People moved through the space differently now, with heads held higher and steps more confident. The shadow of fear that had hung over the community for so long had been replaced by something stronger, the quiet certainty of unified purpose. Sullivan approached one final time, his security team transitioning control to federal authorities. It's really over, he stated, though his tone made it partially a question. 15 years of waiting, watching, preparing, all for this moment. Thomas looked up from his work, his expression carrying the same gentle certainty it always had. No, he replied softly, not over, just beginning. What we did today was remove an obstacle. What happens next? What these people choose to build with their newfound strength. That's the true victory we've been working toward all along. 6 months after Kingston's fall, the financial district had undergone a transformation that went far beyond surface appearances. The Millbrook Commerce Building's restored facade gleamed in the morning sun, but the real changes were evident in the way people moved through the plaza, carrying themselves with quiet confidence that spoke of deep-rooted security rather than enforced order. Thomas Chen's shoeshine stand remained unchanged amidst the evolution around him, his precise movements providing a steady counterpoint to the district's dynamic growth. The morning found him attending to Jonathan Way's shoes, while the banker shared news of the latest community development initiative. The Federal Reserve has approved our community banking charter, Way reported, his expression reflecting professional satisfaction. We're establishing the first financial institution specifically designed to support urban renewal through ethical business practices. Your years of documentation helped us demonstrate the need for this new model. Sarah Martinez approached, carrying a leather portfolio that bore the logo of the newly established Community Justice Center. Her law practice had evolved into something unprecedented. A hybrid organization that combined legal advocacy with community development. The Justice Department is using our case as a template, she informed them. They're implementing similar, long-term observation protocols in cities across the country. Detective Chen, arriving for her morning briefing with her father, added her own update. The Community Integrity Unit has expanded to 3 more precincts, she shared. The Commissioner is calling it the future of urban law enforcement, prevention through community engagement rather than reactive policing. Thomas listened as he worked, his hands moving with unchanged precision across fine leather. The Shoeshiner stand had become more than an observation post or symbol of resistance. It now served as an informal gathering point where community leaders could share insights and coordinate efforts while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. Michael Sullivan joined them, his security team now operating under a new paradigm that emphasized community integration over force projection. "We've completely redesigned our training protocols," he explained. "New officers learn about community dynamics and relationship building before they ever touch tactical equipment. Your methods have become our foundation." The plaza itself reflected the district's transformation. Where Kingston's men had once patrolled, community ambassadors now moved through the space, helping visitors and maintaining the atmosphere of welcome that had become the district's hallmark. The underground network, fully integrated into the city's infrastructure, hosted regular community events in its renovated spaces. Mr. Park's son had expanded their family business into a cooperative venture that supported other immigrant entrepreneurs. "We're teaching them what we learned from Mr. Chen," he explained during his regular morning tea delivery. "Success isn't just about individual achievement. It's about building networks of mutual support." Thomas maintained his steady routine, each movement as precise as it had been during his years of patient observation. But now his work served a different purpose, demonstrating through consistent action that true authority came from dedication to craft and community rather than displays of power. The district's transformation had drawn attention from urban planners and social scientists studying what they termed organic community resilience. Yet Thomas continued his simple work, showing through example that lasting change required not dramatic gestures, but patient, consistent effort. Sarah often brought prospective partners to the plaza, using the community's visible transformation to illustrate the potential of their approach. "What we've built here," she explained to a visiting delegation of civic leaders, "isn't just about removing negative influences. It's about creating systems that naturally resist corruption through transparency and community engagement." Jonathan Way had established a mentorship program that paired established financial professionals with emerging community entrepreneurs. "The goal," he explained while Thomas attended to his shoes, "is to create sustainable growth that benefits everyone. We're proving that ethical business practices and community development can coexist with profitability." Detective Chen's unit had become a model for departments nationwide, demonstrating how patient intelligence, gathering and community partnership could achieve what force alone could not. "We're not just solving crimes," she noted, watching her father work. "We're preventing them by building relationships that make criminal exploitation less viable." The afternoon sun cast different shadows now across the plaza, not the long, dark stretches of fear that had once dominated the space, but the natural interplay of light and shade that marked healthy urban environments. The district had developed its own rhythm, a steady pulse of commerce and community that proved stronger than any imposed order. Thomas continued his work with unchanging dedication, each precise movement a reminder that true power lay not in dramatic actions, but in patient attention to detail. The Shoeshiner stand remained his chosen post, but its meaning had evolved from a position of quiet resistance to a symbol of enduring principles. "The real victory," he observed softly to his daughter during a quiet moment, "isn't in what we removed, but in what people chose to build in its place." Kingston sought to own this community. Instead, he showed them how to own themselves. The plaza had become a testament to this truth, its daily life demonstrating that the most effective response to corruption was not force, but the patient cultivation of community strength. What had begun as one man's quiet resistance had grown into a movement that transformed not just a district, but the very concept of urban community. 1 year after Kingston's fall, Thomas Chen stood at his shoeshine stand in the transformed plaza, watching the first rays of morning sun illuminate the district he had helped reshape. The Millbrook Commerce Building's renovated facade reflected golden light across the space where a community had discovered its collective strength. His hands moved with the same precise care they always had, each stroke of his polishing cloth a testament to the power of patient dedication. Sarah Martinez emerged from the Community Justice Center, now occupying the entire ground floor of the building where Kingston had once maintained his penthouse office. Under her leadership, the center had become a national model for combining legal advocacy with community development. The Supreme Court cited our case yesterday, she informed Thomas, settling into the customer's chair. They're establishing new precedents for community-based anti-corruption initiatives. Detective Chen arrived for her morning briefing. Her position as head of the expanded Community Integrity Division, reflecting the department's transformation. The Kingston model of organized crime is collapsing across the country, she reported. Communities are adopting our methods, learning to recognize and resist systematic corruption before it can take root. Thomas listened as he worked, his movements unchanged despite the significance of their achievements. The shoeshine stand remained his chosen post, though its meaning had evolved far beyond its original purpose. What had once been a position for gathering intelligence had become a symbol of the patient strength that had transformed a community. Jonathan Way approached, accompanied by representatives from the Federal Reserve, studying the district's innovative community banking system. We're implementing similar programs in 12 other cities, he explained. The combination of ethical finance and community oversight is revolutionizing urban development. The real revolution, Thomas observed quietly, his hands steady at their work, is in how people view their own power. Kingston believed authority flowed from above, imposed through fear and force. We showed them it rises from below, built through trust and cooperation. Michael Sullivan joined them, his security team now training officers from across the country in the new methodology they called Community Integrated Protection. The plaza's daily rhythm demonstrated their success. People moved freely, business thrived, and the atmosphere of fear that had once dominated the space was replaced by confident purpose. Mr. Park's son had expanded their family's initiative into a national network supporting immigrant entrepreneurs. We're teaching what we learned here, he explained, delivering his customary morning tea to Thomas. How strength comes not from standing alone, but from helping others stand with you. The underground network, once a secret resistance infrastructure, had been transformed into community spaces that hosted educational programs, cultural events, and emergency response training. The tunnels that had once hidden their preparations now served as a reminder that the foundations of community strength often lay beneath the surface. Thomas maintained his steady routine, each precise movement an object lesson in the power of patient dedication. Regular customers still brought their shoes for his expert care, but they also brought something more. Stories of how the district's transformation had inspired similar changes in their own communities. Sarah shared news of Kingston's final legal proceedings. He's cooperating now, she noted, watching Thomas work. Something changed during the trial. Seeing how the community responded, how we built something stronger than his organization ever was. It affected him more than any punishment could have. Detective Chen observed her father's unchanging dedication with new understanding. You never needed the shadow of the ghost, she realized aloud. That was just a tool like your brushes and polish. The real power was always in showing people their own strength. Shadows, Thomas replied softly, can protect for a moment, but only light can help things grow. The ghost served his purpose, but what these people built in the light, that's the real legacy. The plaza had become a testament to this philosophy. Where Kingston's men had once patrolled, community ambassadors now moved freely, helping visitors and maintaining the atmosphere of welcome that had become the district's hallmark. Each small business, each community initiative, each new partnership demonstrated that true power lay not in control, but in cooperation. As the morning progressed, Thomas continued his work with unchanging precision. His stand remained a constant in the evolving district, but like everything else, its meaning had deepened. What had once been a strategic position had become a reminder that the most profound changes often came through simple, consistent actions performed with unwavering purpose. "The work is never really finished," he observed to Sarah and his daughter, as they prepared to begin another day of their respective duties. Each shoe requires the same care, each right requires the same protection, each community needs the same patient attention. But now you understand, it's not about waiting for someone to save you, it's about building something worth preserving, together. The sun climbed higher over Millbrook's transformed financial district, illuminating a community that had discovered its own strength. Thomas Chen continued his chosen work, his quiet dedication a reminder that true change came not through dramatic gestures, but through the patient polish of daily effort, the steady shine of unwavering principle, and the enduring power of people who chose to stand together in the light. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.